Hello, I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. The city of Philadelphia has been home to a vibrant and well-documented musical heritage, stretching back, believe it or not, to colonial times. Innovation in classical music, opera, R&B, jazz, and soul have earned the music of Philadelphia national and international acclaim. So, how cool it must be to be a disc jockey on the radio, right? How many times have you asked yourself that question? Listening to the radio, whether in the car, or maybe even listening to the radio at home. Really, radio and these disc jockeys have been part of the fabric of our life, not only here in Philadelphia, but across the country. My next guest has been there. He's done that and so much more. And he's documented his life and times in radio. And T. Morgan joins us here on this edition of the Philly Factor. T. Morgan is the author of Confessions of a Teenage Disc Jockey. T is currently heard on WMGK, 102.9 FM in Philadelphia. He's also worked as a music critic. He's a graduate of LaSalle. T started his career on the radio at the age of 15 in Scranton, and he's worked his way up and has worked at many of the heritage stations here in Philadelphia. And some of those stations are still around, and some cases, they faded into the background. T. Morgan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Started at the age of 15.
15 years old.
In Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Scranton, Pennsylvania. The station was 500 watts at night and 1,000 watts during the day, which means at night you couldn't hear it in West Scranton. But,
right.
you know, nonetheless, you were on the air.
Mm-hmm.
And the people always ask me how I got that job, and I just became a nuisance. I really did. I mean, I didn't realize I was a nuisance at the time. But I used to come to the radio station almost on a daily basis.
Right.
I learned an awful lot about the music, and when the time came, it was like a Hollywood movie. We have a problem here. There's nobody to fill in for, you know, that kind of thing.
Right.
And they knew I knew the music, stone cold. I said, well, give the kid a shot. What the heck? And from then on, I've been on the air.
The rest, they say, is history, right?
It's all history.
Yeah. You know, much of, you know, sometimes you will hear people say, it's being at the right place at the right time. Some would say that happened to you, but you had this not only thirst to work in radio, but knowledge of music.
Right.
And sometimes that gets lost in the mix today. People think they could just walk into a radio station and you say, you know, perhaps be a nuisance. I say sometimes it borders on being a stalker in some of these
right, yeah.
lobbies where people sit and wait for somebody to come out to sort of talk to them. But it's so important not only to know what radio is about, but really know your craft. You just can't turn on a button, push a button, get on the air and start talking. You really have to know about the music that you're playing.
And that I did. If they read the book, they're going to see that I spent an awful lot of time, not only at the radio station, but at record stores.
Mm-hmm.
I would go and I'd look at all the music, and I actually had the entire top 100 memorized. Who wrote the song, who produced it, what label it was. I could even tell you what color the label was. You know, I did much better with that than I did with my Latin vocabulary.
Yeah, right.
At the high school level, trust me.
Yeah. You mentioned record stores, another thing that has, you know, has gone
Disappeared,
away.
yeah.
You know, but you know, on the internet today, you could pretty much find that information. And really, we'll get into a little bit later how computers have really revolutionized the way that we do radio today. So you launch on this career in radio. One thing that I learned in reading your book is that you weren't just a disc jockey in the typical sense that you were on the air and you played music, but as your career moved on, you actually moved into positions of management at some radio stations, and were responsible for launching here in Philadelphia the first classic album-oriented radio station.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that was Wi-Fi?
That was WI-Fi, yeah, Wi-Fi 92.
Yeah, when you say Wi-Fi today, it means something completely
well,
different.
Certainly. It's a great name, though.
Exactly, it's a great name.
Way ahead of its time.
Yeah. So what was that like for you to not only, you know, here you are working as a disc jockey, but now you're crafting something that was unheard of at that point?
Well, there wasn't any role model. I mean, there were two other stations that actually preceded what I did here in Philadelphia, but I couldn't hear them. Again, before the internet, and I had no way of knowing what they were doing. Oddly enough, Tom Donahue, who also was a former Philadelphia disc jockey, worked at WIBG, which I eventually worked at as well, went out to San Francisco and got fed up with the whole top 40 scene. He says, we're going to do something different. They didn't know what they were doing, but they did something different. Well, of course, in San Francisco at the time, you had the Jefferson Airplane, and you had Country Joe and the Fish, and Moby Grape. I mean, you had so many different groups who were spawned right there in San Francisco, that it was a whole lot easier to figure out what you were going to do. Just play a lot of local groups.
Sure.
But in New York, there was another guy who I got to know later on by the name of Scott Muni, oddly enough an ex-Marine, turned hippie, as it were, that started it. He was an MCA good guy, top 40 jock, and he started a whole different thing at WOR-FM. Didn't last very long, oddly enough, but then WNEW-FM decided it was a viable format and took over. I think the reason, and I point this out in the book, that we were able to do what we did. I mean, I was just a young kid. You know, who's this kid with all this knowledge about, we should be playing, who country doing the fish? What the heck is that? The mothers of invention?
Right, right.
Seriously, you can't be serious about
Right.
it. But the thing that made it different was that no one cared about FM. The people that owned the station, in fact, WIBG is a perfect example. They owned an FM facility. It was a closet, basically,
Right.
with a tape machine running on it. They didn't see it as being a viable signal at all. They turned it back into the FCC.
Wow.
Believe it or not. That signal eventually became WYSP.
How about that?
And certainly a valuable property. They just didn't see a future. And it's sad, really, when you think about it, that the guy who invented FM did a fantastic job. He created a signal that was clear. The only thing that was wrong with it is it couldn't go as far as the AM signals, but you could hear it clearly as a bell. He actually committed suicide because the people, the powers to be, kept him from really expanding the idea of being on FM. So when we took over, we had a very, very small percentage of people who were listening to FM radio. That all changed, and it changed a lot of it by government mandate. The big advantage that AMs had was that all the cars had AM radio, but they did not have FM. I know I was one of those ones that bought a converter so I could have the FM in there. But for the most part, you didn't buy a car with an FM radio in it. That was a luxury. They decided that that was an unfair advantage, so the government, trying to do an equal playing field, mandated that all cars from thenceforth would have an FM in it. Prior to that, though, I mean, one of the reasons when I went to WIBG, that I played a lot of the same music that the FM was playing is because I knew people were listening to the car radio on the way to work and on the way home, but they weren't listening to us at night.
Sure.
They were listening to the FMs at night because they were home with their fancy get-ups, you know. I mean, God, everybody spent a fortune on stereo equipment back in the day. I mean, these huge speakers, like, look at that, as big as that door. You know? It's like, that changed the whole landscape of things.
Was FM considered then primarily, I mean, we hear the term underground. Was that, I mean, was that part of the underground radio movement because it was there, but people really didn't, unless you were an enthusiast, like you just described some of these people, it was there, but people had to go looking for it in order to find it. And High Lit, one of the legendary disc jockeys in Philadelphia, was he part of that movement?
Well, he was and he wasn't. He was early on, I can tell you that. It was about maybe 6 months after I started it, he decided that he was going to do the same thing at WDAS-FM. The problem that he ran into, well, there were a myriad of problems which I cover in the book, but the biggest problem he ran into was that his personality was identified so closely with Top 40 radio that it was like a leopard trying to get rid of his spots.
Sure.
You know, and people were just not buying it. They really weren't. It made it worse that he still had a TV show. He was still high lit. You know, and then he'd get on the FM and he'd go, hi, this is High Lit. Like, huh? Who is this guy?
Right.
So those of us who worked with him naturally rebelled because we had our own thing we wanted to do, and it was nothing like Top 40. The book points out the many, many conflicts that we had, some of them very humorous, others not quite so humorous, but you know, High Lit was a very complex and simple person at the same time. He was easy to figure out on one level and very difficult to figure out on another, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
But we became friends, and as a matter of fact, we did a TV show together called I Love Music. So it was funny because he hired me, gave me my first job as a program director, and then years later, when I was at WIBG, I hired him to work for me.
How about that? Yeah,
So
yeah.
it goes full cycle.
Yeah. For the audience that is listening and watching right now, they hear the term program director. So explain to me, and maybe the role has changed over all the years, but in those days of radio where you worked as a program director, what really was your job? What was your responsibility?
Well, in those days, unlike today, if you're a program director today, you really orchestrate things. You have a promotion staff, you have a programming staff, you have different people that are responsible to you. Mm-hmm. When I first started out as program director, you were the ideas guy, you promoted it yourself, you put everything together, right, and then you went and told people what we're doing, right, basically. You did filter the music to a certain degree, but in those days, again, the jocks had a lot of leeway. So they played pretty much whatever they wanted. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't say, all right, this is our playlist and you have to play this and this is when you play that. Unlike Top 40. When Top 40, everything was totally structured. Mm-hmm. You had absolutely no input whatsoever. In fact, you almost had to force yourself to come up with some way of putting into a personality into what you were doing, because it was very difficult to have a personality in Top 40 radio. And I had a lot of respect for people who were able to do that, and many of the best ones were here in Philadelphia, that were able to inject a personality in 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that?
Sure.
You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. A guy like, probably your listeners or viewers rather, have no idea who I'm talking about, but Dan Ingram in WABC in New York, mm-hmm, was probably the master of doing that. I listened to him every day, not because of the music, because I wanted to hear what he had to say and how he did it.
Sure.
And one of the things you do when you're an aspiring anything is you look at people you know are very good at it and try to emulate them as much as you can. You can't be just like them. I didn't want to be a Dan Ingram. I didn't want to be a Top 40 disc jockey, mm-hmm, for that matter. But he did things that you would say to yourself, now if I could do that in a different way, be more laid back about it, that might be a way to inject a personality. There was a guy who now lives, ironically enough, in the Philadelphia area by the name of Dick Summer. And you might want to check him out. He has his own blog and website and whatever. And I actually contacted him while putting this book together. And it turned out to be as nice a guy as I hoped he would be. Mm-hmm. He had a show overnights at WBZ in Boston. Now you say, earlier on you said, you got to be prepared and you got to really love it. I was a fanatic about listening to radio. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would stay up all night to the point where, I say this in the book, I think I set a record at Scranton Central High School for the number of latenesses, because I would be up listening to Dick Summer in the middle of the night, right? But Dick Summer introduced me to people like the Beatles and Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, and he was playing things that no one else was playing, primarily I think because he was overnight, and the boss said, well, no, he's listening to them anyway, let him do his thing. So he had a more laid-back approach too. He had more of a personality, and he was very clever in the way he put things together. And I said, now, if he can do it, I can do it.
Sure.
So then he became the person that I really looked up to and tried to emulate as much as I possibly could. And when I went into Philadelphia radio and put this program together at WIFI, my thoughts were, if everybody could have a personality without talking for 5 minutes, you don't have to do 10 seconds, but keep it under a minute, 30 seconds, then we have something here.
The other thing too that I find remarkable is that you are a proponent of when people call a radio station, look, in many cases, especially when you're working nights, that voice on the radio may be the only connection that some people have with the outside world. In your book, you say that it is vital, it is important for you to answer the phone. And oftentimes people would call the radio station, wherever it is you were working, you would pick up the phone and they would ask to speak with T. Morgan, and here it was you on the phone. So again, not to disparage or paint with a broad brush today, there tends to be a little bit of disconnect between the on-air persona and the audience, because I guess things and times have changed and the business has changed. But you really believe that it was vital to have that connection with the listener by simply picking up the phone and talking to them.
Absolutely. The most important, you're there for them. They're not there for you. Mm-hmm. So, and I think unfortunately a lot of people have that opinion, like they're a star. I mean, you're not a star, you're a guy on the radio.
Right.
You're lucky enough to have a job.
Sure.
Don't even worry about it. So, I tried, and I know that a lot of people over the years told me that, hey, I met my wife while listening to your show, you know, we
Right.
fell in love,
Right.
and the music you played is so much a part of our life, and could you play this song? You know, that's important. That's
Sure.
really, really important. And a lot of people don't, and even people who I work with will call me, and they say, you answer the phone. It's like a lot of people just let it ring, and it just rings and rings and rings, no one ever had it. Now, in defense of that, we have 7 lines.
Yeah.
So, you know, sometimes you'll be talking to somebody and I'll have to say, look, I got other calls coming in, I really got to go, which is good when you have a nut job calling you.
Right.
That happens frequently,
happens,
you know.
yeah.
Boy, you get people who are like, what planet did you just come in from? It's like, oh, it's another dimension, I'm sorry, not
Yeah,
another
right.
planet, I got you, okay.
Yeah.
But, and sometimes they have requests of things that I've never even heard.
Sure.
And I know music. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
you really wanted me to play what? No, that's not going to happen. So, but you're kind to them.
One of the things that in my career, you always get these memos, and sometimes the memo from the boss is complimentary, and sometimes the memo is not so complimentary. I read in the book that, I think it was at WIBG, that you were actually fined $25 every time you did something that you were not supposed to do. And in the book, it goes on for like 2 pages of what you must do and what you must not do. And if you deviated from that, you were going to get fined $25. And the memos document, you know, to whoever was keeping the books there that, you know, T. Morgan did this, so please deduct $25. You know, first of all, I have to compliment you on keeping all those memos, but you know, you look back at it today and you say, I can't believe that they did that. But was that a heavy-handed way to run a radio station, or was it a way to ensure that the disc jockeys were going to do what they were supposed to do?
Well, I think it may be a combination of both. A lot of disc jockeys have an ego problem.
Sure.
And I was never one of them. My father was a commander in the Navy for 25 years, and he ran his house like that. And there was no way you could have an ego in our family. I mean, he beat the living daylights out of you. So I had a different approach to things. And I think that there were some things that were very unfair about it. Like, I know one of the fines that I got, there's no way I was guilty of it, but there was no way of going to court, so to speak.
Sure.
You couldn't approach the guy and say, well, wait a minute, where's your proof? But other things were kind of silly, too. I mean, you know, you get fined for reading the wrong temperature, as it were, or reading the right temperature, which is the wrong way to do it. You know, I'll let people read the book to find out what that's all about.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a need for some rules and regulations on anything. I mean, you can't run a radio station without some structure, you know. And I think they try to do that a lot of times in the so-called underground radio stations, and it just didn't work because there was no cohesiveness at all. You could listen to John Doe, and he was different than listening to Harry Smith. And sometimes people like John and didn't like Harry, and vice versa. They stopped listening to the radio station. Well, you can't have that happen. You want to have listeners. It's still a business, you know. And that was some of the things that a lot of people who were part of the underground movement didn't understand. As long as we didn't have that many listeners, the powers to be could do whatever you want. But as soon as you started getting ratings, and people started saying, can we buy time on the station? And they saw a possibility of making lots of money, then things started to change. And it needed to change. It really did need to change.
We're talking with T. Morgan. The name of his book is Confessions of a Teenage Disc Jockey. Not only are the memos in the book, you have some great photos in the book too. On the back, one of the back pages, there's a picture of you and Dolly Parton.
Yeah.
The two of you went out to dinner.
Couldn't resist that.
Couldn't resist, yeah. What a way to sum up everything in the book with T. Morgan and Dolly Parton. So I suspect, and I mean, I guess this is one of the questions you get a lot is, you know, who was your most famous interview, or who was the best interview? Who was the best person that you ever met in your career?
Well, I cover a lot of it in the book. And again, we haven't discussed this, but I have a website too. It's tmorganonline.com. It's all one word, tmorganonline.com. You can purchase the book there too if you'd like. There are so many people that I interviewed. Interesting may not be the right word to use, but I would say the most unusual interviews were people that you wouldn't expect. Like, for example, I interviewed Soupy Sales.
Okay.
And for those who don't know, Soupy Sales used to have a kids show, basically. And Soupy was so much funnier without the kids show than he was on the kids show, because he really was a clever guy. And he was really into the music. his sons, for example, played with Todd Rundgren in the band Utopia. And he knew his music, and he was a great interview and a lot of fun. Another guy that was very interesting was Mel Blanc, who was the voice for Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, and I mean, the man of 1,000 voices. Sure. He was hilarious. Right. He was funnier than the cartoon characters. And you didn't expect these things. I was like, the boss said, "Hey, would you like to interview Mel Blanc?" Mel Blanc, why would I? He says, "That's cartoons. He's got to do with the music, Right. But hilarious. And we actually had a running thing with Warner Brothers, because when I was at WMMR, our logo had Bugs Bunny in it. Because Warner Brothers, and so we were allowed to do a lot of things, so it was natural to have him on the show, but at the time I didn't understand the link until I actually interviewed him. He was just great. Yeah. So there were non-music people that were interesting. Another person that most people wouldn't know that would be interesting was Paul McCartney's brother. Now, I never interviewed Paul McCartney. In the book I tell you how close I came to interviewing him, but I did not interview Paul McCartney. But his brother was a great interview. He gave me so much information I probably never would have gotten from Paul McCartney. Inside stuff about the family, and how Paul McCartney loved the Bonzo Dog Band, which is a group that no one in this country probably even heard of. They used to have their own TV show. They were kind of like, if those of you who know Monty Python, they were like Monty Python put to music. Sure. They were hilarious. Their humor was very English, and a lot of Americans didn't even understand what they were saying. But Paul loved the band, and he ended up producing, under alias, one of the records. And also that Bonzo Dog Band was on one of the Beatles records. Look up the name, and find out. Well, all the saxophone playing, that's the Bonzo Dog Band. How about that? And they were good friends. And then Neil Ennis, who was part of that group, the Bonzo Dog Band, started a parody of the Beatles called the Ruddles. So it all comes full circle again.
For sure. As I said, if that was one of the top questions that you're asked, I'm sure one of the top 5 questions has got to be, so I want to be in radio. How can I be like T. Morgan, and how can I get on the radio and be a disc jockey?
Well, the first part we went over already. Be absolutely prepared. And for those of you who are watching this that go to LaSalle, you already got a good step, because LaSalle was a great preparation for me. And I'm part of the broadcast pioneers, and we were just talking about this outside before the show. I'm on the committee that picks scholarships, and LaSalle got 3 of the scholarships this year. And one of the reasons that they were selected is because their essays were so well written. Now, I know a lot of kids today think it's not very cool. It's like you put a U instead of YOU, and the whole texting thing and stuff like that. But guess what? Your peers are not going to give you a job. It may be cool with them, but the people who have the power to actually give you a job don't like it. All right? So write professionally, dress professionally. These are old things. But those things are important. But the main thing is that you have a passion for what you really want to do. If you think you want to do it, that's not enough. You have to know, I will go through walls to get a job in this industry. Because a lot of these jobs that look very glamorous are not that glamorous. They really are. There's a lot of hard work. I know when I was program director of a few radio stations, you're talking 16, 18-hour days. My family didn't see me on holidays. You have to sacrifice a lot to get what you want. If you're not willing to pay the price, you're not going to get what you want.
Sure. And the program director is probably the first person that gets the call when someone's calling out sick.
Sure, yeah.
And then you have to scramble either to fill the job yourself or get someone in to fill that position.
And of course, no one answers the phone.
Of course.
So you're the guy that has to do the job.
That's right. And now with cell phones, they can see exactly who's calling,
yes,
and then you decide whether you want to take the call or not, right?
Exactly.
Again, the name of the book is Confessions of a Teenage Disc Jockey. You can go to tmorganonline.com. You can purchase the book there. You can also find out what T is up to on a daily basis. He updates the website on a daily basis. What is it that you hope people take away from your book?
Well, that's an interesting question. No one ever asked me that before. The only reason I wrote the book is because so many people said, you've got to write a book. And I said, no, I don't. I kept fighting it for years and years and years. And finally I broke down And it was actually Andre Gardner, who's somebody I worked with at WMGK, was instrumental in twisting my arm and said, you know, you got too many good stories here. You got to write this book. Right. So it became a process of trying to eliminate the stories to get down to what the average person would actually get out of this. And some of the things that I point out in the book is that everything you do in this life is important. Whether guy next door thinks it's a complete waste of time, it doesn't matter. Everything's important or nothing is. Because in reality, what you're doing today will mean nothing to people 100 years from now, unless you're Hitler or, you know, do something catastrophic. You're not going to be in the history books. What's important is that you do something that satisfies you and maybe makes somebody else happy in some fashion. So if you're a nurse, or if you're a teacher, or if you're a disc jockey, you do something to help the general public. That's the most important thing. Yeah. And I think you get a lot of that in the book. I hope so, anyway. Yeah.
In the minute that we have left, you know, what is the secret to success in this business then? Is it accepting everything that is thrown at you? Is it to be resilient? Is it to hold your ground? I mean, look, because, you know, a lot of times people want to, you know, quick bang for the buck. They want to get in, they want to make the money, and then they want to get out. And they're not in it for the long term. But in your career, where you've been doing this for a long time, what is the real recipe for success in this business?
Well, there's no one recipe, or otherwise I'd be a very rich man selling it. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, you need to really understand that you may not have the dream job right out of the box. Sure. Okay? Be willing to do almost anything to get ahead. I'm not talking about, you know, destroy people's lives, right, but personally sacrifice things to get what you want out of this job. There's no small job. There really isn't. There's only small people. That's basically what it comes down to. The other thing is be persistent and don't be discouraged, because you're going to get hit in the head 50 times before something good happens. Yeah. You know, and you have to be prepared for that. Forget the ego, because you leave that at the door.
Well, it's been a fascinating half hour with my guest, T. Morgan, Confessions of a Teenage Disc Jockey. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure. And stay tuned. We have much more ahead. We thank you for watching The Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. Thanks for being with us.